Next up, we're going to have a legislative update from Mark Phillips and Matt Hill. Mark Phillips is the ITC Research and Information Specialist. He was born in Portland, Oregon in 1949. He graduated from the University of Oregon in 1971 and went to work for an Oregon member of Congress where his responsibilities included Native American issues. In 1975, he joined Edwards Associates Incorporated, a small lobbying firm representing Northwest interests, where Mark principally represented several Oregon tribes. In 1981, Mark served as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at Interior, after which he returned to Edwards Associates, where the ITC became one of his clients. He has continued to work with the ITC since then on federal issues, and in 2012 moved back to Portland, from where he now conducts his business. He has arranged with Matt Hill to carry out Washington, D.C. based activities. And since they're tag teaming this, Matt Hill serves as an information specialist to the ITC in Washington. He previously worked in the United States Senate for 10 years, focusing on tribal and forest management issues for Senator Gordon Smith of Oregon. Matt is a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He is originally from Roseburg, Oregon, and currently resides in Maryland. Let's welcome Mark.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Dave, Koch, we're short-stopping you here, I'm afraid. I always liked going after the Bureau of Indian Affairs presentation because it gave me a chance to kind of revise things in my own way. But we're sure that you'll be up right after Matt and myself, and the shoe will be on the other foot. Kelly, thank you for that kind introduction. And good morning to all. As Kelly mentioned, Matt Hill on next. We'll cover the broader congressional forestry issues and ITC's involvement therein. I will cover elections, appropriations, and various odds and ends. After last May's symposium, and up until December, Congress didn't do much of anything of interest, principally due to its continuing rancorous partisan divide and the run-up to last November's midterm congressional elections, a period when Congress typically slows way down, pardon me, to avoid creating any new controversy that could play into the elections. The elections, of course, did roll around November 4th with a resounding Republican victory. Republicans increased their House majority and gained the Senate majority with 54 seats. When the 114th Congress was sworn in on January 6, 2015, new Republican Senate committee chairs included Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming at the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska at Energy and Natural Resources. Murkowski is also the new chair of the Senate Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, and she continues as a member of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. Please note that the new Republican Senate, like the Democratic Senate last Congress, does not have a filibuster-proofed majority. So you can expect as little progress this Congress as there was last. And of course, President Obama will wield a veto pen for the next year and a half. Gridlock has not gone away just yet. Over in the House, with Representative Doc Hastings' retirement, the chair of the Natural Resources Committee is now Representative Rob Bishop of Utah. Representative Don Young continues as chair of the subcommittee with jurisdiction over Native American issues. Following the elections, Congress did reconvene for a December lame duck session because some work still did need to get done, most particularly a defense authorization bill and appropriations for fiscal year 2015. Because the large 2015 defense authorization bill was a principal moving vehicle in the lame duck session, a lot of unrelated issues were attached to it, including tribal matters such as settlement of Sea-Alaska land issues and land conveyances for the T-Mohawk tribe, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Ho-Chunk Nation. Unfortunately, it also conveyed Forest Service land in Arizona, sacred to the Apaches, to a copper mining company, and opened to public access land on Rattlesnake Mountain in Washington state that is sacred to the Yakima and Umatilla tribes. Almost all other tribal legislation died at the end of last Congress. On appropriations, after several continuing resolutions to keep things funded after the October 1st start of fiscal year 2015, on December 13th, Congress finalized, and on December 16th, the President signed the mammoth FY 2015 Consolidated and Further Continuing Appropriations Act, providing full-year funding as Public Law 113-235. Division F of that law provides fiscal year 2015 appropriations for Interior, Environment, and related agencies. There, for FY 2015 BIA Operation of Indian programs, Congress accepted most of the administration's fiscal year 2015 request, an increase of $33.8 million over FY 14, and then added another $16 million, mostly for education, for an OIP total of $2.429 billion. In natural resources management, forestry got the only congressional increase, pardon me, over the requested amount, an increase of $1.84 million, replacing a similar amount that had been transferred to self-governance, for a total of $47.7 million. The only natural resources decrease was $1 million for the Integrated Resource Information Program, the old IRMP, which at $3 million is still $1 million above FY 14. As Phil mentioned, there was also House report language urging the Forest Service and BLM to make wider use of Tribal Forest Protection Act, and President Rigdon's testimony, the IFMAT 3 report, and Matt Hill's working with the staff all contributed to these positive responses in the appropriations bill. For the DOI Office of Wildland Fire, funding levels were generally pretty good. Preparedness got the $319 million requested by the administration, which includes, as Phil mentioned, set-asides of $9 million for tribal contract support costs and $6 million for BIA workforce development. Suppression was increased by $23 million to $291.6 million, and fuels management was increased $17.7 million to $164 million, which includes the administration set-aside of $10 million for tribal projects on federal treaty rights lands and a $10 million increase for the National Resilient Landscape Initiative. Congressional appropriators, however, declined the administration's requested proposal to treat annual fire suppression costs over 70% of the 10-year average as disaster funding. Meanwhile, for FY 15, the Forest Service total budget took a bit of a hit, getting $5.05 billion, down $651 million from the request, and down $423 million from fiscal year 2014. Now, as long as we're on the numbers, let's talk a little bit about FY 2016, which will start this upcoming October 1st. Last February 2nd, the administration sent its fiscal year 2016 budget request to Congress. The BIA Operation of Indian programs requested an increase of $231 million over FY 2015, or about a 9.5% increase. Within that request, BIA Forestry asked for an increase of $4.2 million to a total of about $52 million. Yesterday, the House Interior Appropriations Subcommittee marked up its FY 2016 bill that includes funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Details are still scant, but it appears they gave BIA Operation of Indian programs a $77 million increase above fiscal year 15, instead of the $231 million that the BIA had requested. It is my understanding that the subcommittee did provide an increase for BIA forestry, but I haven't been able yet to confirm the exact numbers. I do not know how the Interior Department Office of Wildland Fire did in the markup, but the request is $805 million, about the same as 2015, along with, once again, the disaster funding proposal that has attached to it a contingent $200 million. Full details should be available in about a week after the full Appropriations Committee meets to mark up and report the bill. At this point, I should say a few words about the Congressional Budget Resolution, which does not become law, but does give Congress general fiscal guidelines for the next 10 years. Last month, the Republican Congress completed the budget resolution for the 10 years starting in fiscal year 2016, the first such budget resolution to be completed in many years. As part of the process, the Senate adopted a budget amendment to accommodate the costs of potentially transferring federal land to the states. In the House, the Natural Resources Committee made a similar request to the Budget Committee, but that was not taken up. While these points are mainly rhetorical and posturing because they're in a non-binding budget resolution, they do indicate some of the thinking of the current Congress. Also, finalization of the budget resolution clears the way for so-called reconciliation legislation, which is intended to conform existing law with the fiscal limits set in the budget resolution. This is regular legislation which can become law, but this year, because it is expected to attempt to repeal Obamacare, it will get vetoed. But even so, the typically massive bill is a magnet for all sorts of provisions, and those will bear close watching. The idea of federal land transfers and other defederalization moves is a rising topic of conversation in Congress, as members on both sides of the aisle are frustrated with hamstrung federal land management practices, and tribes are not being left out of the mix. Chair Don Young of the House Indian, Insular, and Alaska Native Affairs Subcommittee has publicly mused in a committee hearing about transferring federal public land to tribes. And, as Phil mentioned, and as Matt will further discuss, legislation has just been introduced, H.R. 2647, by Representative Westerman of Arkansas, that would allow tribes to manage federal public forests. Chairman Young, meanwhile, vexed by the BIA's inability to promptly process tribal oil and gas permits and leases, has reintroduced his American Indian Empowerment Act, a bill, H.R. 328, to give tribes the option of a sort of trust light, retaining restrictions against alienation and taxation on trust lands, but otherwise freeing those trust lands from federal management oversight. Another defederalization example is Representative Mike Simpson's reintroduction of his Indian Trust Asset Reform Act, H.R. 812, which, while including statements reaffirming the trust, would set up a pilot program for tribes to negotiate with the Interior Secretary to take over management control and responsibilities of trust assets. The flip side would likely be some reduction of federal trust liability. This is not without controversy, but in an April 14th House hearing, the Colvilles, fed up with federal impediments to the utilization of their timber resource, and Ernie Stensgar for Coeur d'Alene and the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians testified in favor of the legislation. The Interior Department testified against it, and also testified against Don Young's Trust Light bill. So there is ferment in the air, and while these things are not likely to see much movement in the near term, given a gridlocked Senate and a Democratic administration, ponder for a moment what the possibilities might be, good or bad, should the country get a Republican trifecta in a year and a half. In wrapping up, I want to note that the Indian Energy Act, with its mandatory biomass demonstration program for tribes on federal public land, has been reintroduced in both chambers and reported in the Senate. Difficulties remain, but hope springs eternal, and thanks goes out again to the Colvilles for their persistence in this legislation. Also, everybody seems to agree with the idea that wildfire suppression costs over 70% of the 10-year average should be funded from federal disaster accounts. But the legislation has been getting hung up in budget accounting issues. Perhaps this year, however, that can get resolved. With that, thank you for your time and attention.